So good evening, everyone. I'm Amelin Ng, current Wortham Fellow.
And I'm Brittany Edding.
And on behalf of Rice Architecture, we would like to welcome you all to today's lecture, Following the Dirt, Troubling Architecture with Hélène Frichot. We want to begin by thanking the Lectures Committee, Interim Dean John Kasbarian, the Rice Design Alliance, and the students, staff, and faculty who helped make this lecture series happen. Before we get started with the introduction, a quick note on the Q&A. For those of you watching the lecture, please feel free to ask a question by typing it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Our student representative, Zi Zheng, will read them out loud after the lecture. So this semester, the Rice Architecture Spring 2021 lecture series, New Proximities, is a collective reckoning of health as a social, political, and fundamentally spatial condition. The global pandemic has not only produced profound shifts in the built environment, but also revealed latent precarities embedded in its forms of governance, labor, domesticity, and ecology. This lecture series asks, how does COVID-19 and its compounding crises render visible the uneven geographies in which we operate? How might we reformat existing systems beyond the confining world of pandemic space? Expanding scales and spaces of architectural agency, we will hear from critical voices in design, history, and theory to imagine new futures of care.
Tonight, we're honored to welcome Hélène Frichot to share her work and research with us this evening. Architectural theorist and philosopher, writer and critic, Hélène is a professor of architecture and philosophy and director of the Bachelor of Design, Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, University of Melbourne, Australia. She's guest professor and the former director of critical studies in architecture, School of Architecture, KTH Stockholm, Sweden. Her recent publications include Dirty Theory, Troubling Architecture, Creative Ecologies, Theorizing the Practice of Architecture, How to Make Yourself a Feminist Design Power Tool. She's editor on a number of collections, including with Katharina Gabrielson and Helen Runting, Architecture and Feminisms, Ecologies, Economies, Technologies, and more recently with Naomi Stead, Writing Architectures, Fictocritical Approaches, and with Marco, Architectural Effects after Deleuze and Guattari. Within the fix of bodies, health, and hygiene, and how the matters and materialities of dirt have profoundly affected our spaces of care. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Hélène. Thank you again and welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the invitation, Amelin, and Brittany and Christine. It's really great to be here today. So I'll share my screen. Now, it's important and customary because I'm sitting in the Australian context to commence by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung of the Kulin Nation, upon whose lands, unceded lands, I work and live, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, I'm going to begin with something of a preamble. We have made a terrible mess of things. We probably don't need to be reminded. And today, I'm sure I need not read out the list of destructions committed on a planetary scale, from climate change to species extinctions to the logics of extractivism. We know by now as architects and designers, wed as we are to the building industry, that 38% of global CO2 emissions are related to what we do. And we should, of course, also add to that the percentage of our voracious production and consumption of data. Still, it's worth reflecting, I think, just briefly on recent news that a perhaps unlikely and decidedly unheroic architectural design duo, Lacaton and Vassal, have won the prestigious Pritzker Prize with an approach editorialized by such critics as Oliver Wainwright as sometimes the answer is to do nothing. And here he is quoting Lacaton. We have, of course, Lacaton and Vassal's example of the public square in Bordeaux. We have examples of social housing and the work that they did at the Palais de Tokyo, all of which is an approach that pays more attention to minor renovation, repair and maintenance than to out and out production of new architectures. And this seems an interesting approach to reflect on briefly. So where are we? Here we are facing what is called the Anthropocene, or the Capitalocene, or the Anthropobscene, or the Plasticine, or the Plantationocene, to riff on Rosie Braidotti's list.
Sorry,
and if
Hélène, sorry, I don't think we're seeing your slides advancing.
Oh no, that's all right. I'm still on the first slide. It's all okay.
Sorry.
I'm taking a little while to get into it. And thinking with philosopher of science Donna Haraway's more joyful exploration of the tentacular, slimy, and monstrous possibilities of the Chthulucene. And meanwhile, of course, as we've heard in the introduction, we're confronting this unprecedented pandemic, unprecedented at least in terms of scale, though perhaps not in terms of being a viral event. So in the context of this, we might well deliberate on whether the answer is not to do something, but rather to do nothing. Though I would counter that to do nothing requires a well-trained, highly experienced and ethically attuned knowledge of one's craft in architecture. To do nothing, furthermore, is to know how to make the best argument when confronted by clients and stakeholders. What might well be taking place in this recent Pritzker award is a small revolution, perhaps, within our discipline, because to do less, it appears we must take the time to care more. Now, to the matter of hand, this small book I'm discussing today, Dirty Theory, Troubling Architecture, which emerged in part out of the book that preceded it, Creative Ecologies, Theorizing the Practice of Architecture, which in its own right drew on an earlier, smaller book, How to Make Yourself a Feminist Design Power Tool. Each of these books, in a way, are test sites, they're open works, they lead one to the other, and they draw on questions of worldly exhaustion. And they ask with Donna Haraway, how can we stay with the trouble in architecture? How can we trouble architecture's status quo and imagine other cleanup acts for our discipline? Ones that are perhaps less glamorous, ones that engage a poetic pragmatics, ones in search of glimmers of joy amidst the islands of unholy mess. Jumping ahead, when I conclude the small book Dirty Theory, I return to a vision of the Enlightenment thinker Immanuel Kant's thought figure of the island of reason, and look back in order to see how it is manifested, finally, as a heap of trash. And yet, like any midden, and a midden is sort of especially known in the Australian context, I suppose, in terms of archaeological digs and the remnants of sort of Indigenous settlement patterns here. Like any midden, there is knowledge to be found amidst the waste and the ruin, and new post-human landscapes to be imagined. But certainly, news media images of visions of a colonized Mars, or, imaginaries as such, imagined geoengineering fix-it tricks, global trade and carbon credits, all seems less convincing, I believe, than a close look at our entanglement in the dirt and waste of our own making. So let's look down at our feet and consider the empirical ground upon which we stand. Now, this lecture is going to be composed in 8 parts or 8 moves, progressing finally towards an ethics of dirty matters of care. And here we commence first with this notion of a dirty materialism. And this is the place in which I acknowledge the background from which, this research and its various trajectories as they shoot up can be situated amidst broadly the environmental humanities, in relation to the feminist post-humanities, and also drawing very much on the feminist domain, or the feminist emphases to be found in what is described as new materialism. Now, when I refigure this for the purposes of this first move as dirty materialism, I kind of draw attention to the conceit of naming materialism new, because after all, I think what we're looking at is rather the sort of dirty entanglements that following the material draw attention to. As Stacey Alemo and Susan Heckman explain in their book from 2008, Material Feminisms, the materiality specifically of bodies and natures has in fact been for a long time been a volatile site for feminist theory. They also reflect at that moment on earlier theoretical orientations that we might recognise from architectural discourse in the 80s and 90s that emphasised culture, discourse, or cultural constructivism, perhaps discourse and language, perhaps at the risk of allowing relational material episto-ontologies to recede into the background. Here, the linguistic turn that they describe at that moment through the 80s and 90s, and an emphasis on the construction of social reality, we also have to accept what we learned from that period, Alemo and Heckman insist, because it did enable feminist scholars to critique the volatile markings of gender, sex, class, and race within cultural systems. But what they argue when they introduce the material feminisms is that the semiotics needed to be better mixed with material admixtures. So rather than discarding the earlier work of the linguistic turn, Alemo and Heckman speak to the specific integration of considerations of material relations to further the feminist project beyond discursive analysis. For example, this has been of particular importance to environmental feminists who want us to take the more than human world and our entanglement with it seriously to expand out into our environmental relations. Interestingly, Alemo and Heckman also draw on Donna Haraway, who's a key thinker running through much of this material, her formulation of the material discursive, better known perhaps as Haraway's material semiotic. Now, this will lead us to move to in the lecture, the benefit of thinking with Haraway and her array of slogans, one of which has informed the subtitle of Dirty Theory, that is Troubling Architecture. Her slogans include such proclamations as "We have never been human," riffing on Latour's notion that we have never been modern, or "Stay with the trouble," or "Perform responsibility." And it's already from the 1980s that Donna Haraway was refusing to rest easy on the discursive side of things. Instead, she wanted to kind of mix up the semiotics with the mess of material relations. And here we have a key concept that's been circulating across the discourse, across essays, that has been infiltrating our thinking, coming from Haraway, coming also from her colleague Karen Barad, and that is this notion of entanglements, which are a particularly kind of dirty concept. So a second concept to complement dirty materialism, one that locates us amidst our complex worldly relations, is this concept of entanglements, or else perhaps what the architectural scholar Peg Rawls might call our relational architectural ecologies that are composted of the three registers of mental, social, and environmental ecologies, whereby we expand what we understand by ecologies to include our subjective situation, our social power relations, and our environmental embeddedness, and expand this toward more than human relations. These are dirty relations that draw attention to our profound human and more than human entanglements. For this is the ground upon which we not only stand, but with which we compost as complex organic and inorganic assemblages. So what is this concept of entanglement that I find so fruitful for thinking dirty theory? Donna Haraway explains that entanglements are world-making and messy. The complex patternings of our environment worlds emerge from entangled association. Individual animals, humans, and non-humans are entangled assemblages of relatings, knotted at so many scales and times with other assemblages, organic or not. The dynamic dance of their dirty interminglings result in material semiotic nodes or knots in which diverse bodies and meanings co-shape one another. Amidst the troubles, Haraway invites us to witness the decidedly joyful orientations of dirt. She writes, "I want to stay with the trouble, and the only way I know to do that is in generative joy, terror, and collective thinking." And we can pay attention here also to the affects that she's introducing to us, that joy is mixed with terror, and the importance here of collective thinking. Now, this then leads me to this small and dirty book. And this kind of play that I'm making between dirt as subject material and dirty theory as an approach. And here we have the cover of Dirty Theory, Troubling Architecture, and the contents page. It's important, and I've introduced this book a number of times in a number of different contexts, and every time I introduce it, I feel that it's really important to qualify it by saying that it is a small book. It's kind of like a promissory note to myself. It was written with a lot of pleasure, and I'm happy to hear often that when people read it, they get a lot of joy out of it. At the same time, of course, it's treating very serious matters. Importantly, it doesn't necessarily propose anything novel. It barters in the second hand, and it redistributes pre-loved concepts. It also importantly undertakes boundary transgressions, because dirty theory upsets the status quo. That's its aim. It gets dirt in the gears, it clogs up things, it slows things down. So we have dirt as a subject matter has to be understood as deeply ambivalent. In some instances, it can produce nurturing effects, such as the good soil in which we, grow our food. In other instances, it can produce the breakdown of the organic body. And while probably we can't really define a virus as dirt, nevertheless, a virus operates in such a way as to break down the capacity of a body and a collective body to operate. So this leads us to, first the mixed disciplines. So importantly, I would also stress that dirty theory is inherently interdisciplinary and undertakes this boundary transgression of moving across disciplinary domains. We find the dirt in architectural theory. We find the dirt in even a history of architectural theory. Importantly, I've got Jennifer Bloomer sitting here in the middle. And happy to say that there's another quiet project going on in the background for me with a colleague, Emma Cheetle. We're going to do a special edition of the Journal of Architecture, returning to Jennifer Bloomer's work. But that's another story. We find dirt in the domain of geography with Ben Campkin and Rosie Cox's work. We find it in literary and cultural studies with Terence McLaughlin. And importantly, we find our first definitions, or most oft cited definitions of dirt, with the work of Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, who offers the neatest definition of dirt, and probably one of the most cited, that dirt is matter out of place, but matter located where it is judged not to belong is necessarily judged by someone, or rather judged by some societal context organized around societal norms and structures. Douglas explains that this simple formula that she offers directs us toward order and then the contravention of ordered relations, because dirt is that which crosses boundaries, challenges decorum, and contravenes norm. The low, the reduced, the underfoot, the despised, the rejected, the expelled are at the same moment the accumulated ground upon which the powerful steady themselves in order to reach the rarefied heights. So dirt and dirty relations are inherently about power relations too. Now, for me, it's interesting when we do go back to discover this early definition of dirt, which is very neat and which has been discussed in many kind of ways that are even contradictory, that Douglas's formula is in fact derived from the work of the pragmatist philosopher William James. Douglas quotes James at length in a passage that concludes, "Here we have the interesting notion of there being elements of the universe which may make no rational whole in conjunction with the other elements, and which, from the point of view of any system which those elements make up, can only be considered so much irrelevance and accident, so much dirt, as it were, and matter out of place." So we find here again the dynamics of order and disorder, and that which disrupts systems and threatens the infrastructures that support everyday life, that which undoes social relations and causes political unrest, that which seems to lack sense or threatens a milieu, social or otherwise, with nonsense, irrelevance, and accident, belongs in this category that James defines as dirt. But its effects are not always bad. And I'm going to eventually, when I get to the conclusion of this paper, I'll talk about how this mode of disruption can produce possibilities for creation and other forms of social relation. So there's possibility embedded in the disruptive aspect of dirt that I'm really trying to draw out with this notion of dirty theory. Now, the subtitle of this small book is called Troubling Architecture, and it's about troubling in two senses. We've seen how dirt is inherently about these boundary transgressions, whether it's across disciplines, messing disciplines up together, whether it's about challenging societal norms. Dirt is that which troubles our assumptions about things. But troubling too, in this small book, I'm drawing on two key feminist thinkers. In the first instance, we have Judith Butler from her early work on gender trouble, where she speaks of the troubling performances of gender and constructions of subjectivity. And here we might be helped to ask, who is this architect after all that we imagine when we speak of architectural projects? And how might we trouble our assumptions about their performance? And this is why I started, of course, with Lacaton and Vassal, who I think offer us other ways of thinking what an architect is and what an architect can do. And then, of course, importantly, Donna Haraway, who I have already cited today, with her slogan about the importance of staying with the trouble and acknowledging that we are entangled amidst our precarious environment worlds. And thereby we might ask, well, amidst what environment worlds is the architect intimately entangled? And are they paying enough attention to these worlds, and are they caring enough? So this brings us then to move 5. So in situating this idea of the subject matter of dirt and dirty theory as an approach, so we have subject matter and approach, both, and there is also the call on us to follow the dirt and to follow the materials. Once we get our head around new orientations to material relations, then this suggests both different ways of thinking and different ways of practicing amidst our environment worlds. At the conclusion of my small pink book, How to Make Yourself a Feminist Design Power Tool, I have a chapter dedicated to the ethics of following the material. And I argue that to follow the material of your local environment world requires imminent ethical action. We can't put off our work until a kind of, hopeful future that we're awaiting. We can't put off action in the constructions of utopias that are yet to come. We have to act immediately par le milieu from the midst of the troubling relations we find ourselves in the midst of. So for the architect and designer, to follow the material is an exercise in learning what materials can do, as well as understanding the implications of specifying one material rather than another. To follow the material requires breaking with bad hylomorphic habits, specifically breaking with the assumption that form or lofty idea should take precedence over material distribution, and that matter is merely that stuff we use to fill in the abstract shapes of our conceptual design experiments. Too often, material in architecture as elsewhere is the after effect, how we as designers colour in the spaces between the lines. And now this, of course, is dangerous and irresponsible. And so what we need is something like an ethical know-how that must be practiced via trial and error, that stays close to the ground, following the rumblings of things. So what do I mean further by following the material, and how can we think of this in terms of the ethical orientation it invites us to direct ourselves toward? I'm drawing, yes, on the earlier work of Deleuze and Guattari, who argue about how we understand matter, that matter is subject to continuous variation, that it persists for as long as its duration allows amidst a perpetual flux of environmental encounters, performing according to its capacities and effects. And when we take on matter with such an understanding, then I think also our actions as architects and designers are rather directed towards maintenance and repair. Deleuze and Guattari spell out the consequence of understanding matter as flux and flow by insisting that this matter flow can only be followed. Following can be undertaken in place, much as, for instance, the craftsperson follows the wood while stationed at her work table. But it is, of course, also necessary to venture into the woods to source the right kind of wood with the right kind of fibers. The craftsperson, the designer, must venture out of the safe circle of her studio and venture further afield to gain material knowledge and know-how. She must enter into negotiations with materials, and this requires an ethics of care. Questions that emerge when following the ethical imperative, follow the material, might include all of these questions of, you know, what wood has been used, where has it come from, what global journeys has it already undertaken before it has arrived on my workbench, who has been affected in this journey, what labouring bodies have been made more vulnerable. To draw on Pauline Lefebvre's work, who is looking very closely at ways of following the material, we might understand these relations in terms of our cohabitation with materials and how we must constantly negotiate with them in undertaking this work of following the materials. And of course, these kinds of orientations, as I think become slowly clear, also require, importantly, processes of decolonisation. So move 6 in this presentation today, which is to draw attention to chapter 11 of Dirty Theory, which ventures toward dirt and colonisation, or the importance of processes of decolonisation. As Zeman argues in a special edition of Cultural Studies dedicated to extractivism, dirty energy saturates our social and cultural imaginaries, shapes bodily affect, and figures our deepest unconscious presumptions and desires. When we think of the dirt and its relation to decolonisation and the landscapes that have been affected and those labouring bodies likewise contaminated, we can think according to a simple diagram of the dig and the dump, I argue, in Dirty Theory. And then we can multiply this on a planetary scale, much as has been argued by thinkers such as Martin Arboleda. And to follow the material and to understand its colonial pasts and to move towards stories with a decolonial agenda, as Jane Hutton beautifully demonstrates in her book, Reciprocal Landscapes, might be as simple as understanding the sources of the material that we've used. Here, the hill of guano on an island off the coast of Chile, at the top part of her book cover, and the way in which it has been harvested and distributed historically on Central Park, making that sort of journey to undertake that work in the way leading to the enslavement of labouring bodies and their short lives and violent deaths. And this is what we can often bear witness to in hearing of these material stories. Likewise with Brenna Bandar and her colonial lives of property, drawing attention to the formation of notions of private property and being part and parcel of a colonial project. And here I begin to head toward the direction of future work in this chapter. I was pointing out earlier how Dirty Theory, each of its chapters in a way is a promise to future possible work, and extractivism in its relation to issues of colonial logics and the importance of thinking decolonialism becomes an important concept, as we see here in this special issue of Cultural Studies dedicated to this notion of extractivism, understood as both an analytical but also a political concept that allows us to understand logics of exploitation and subjectification. Likewise, too, we find quickly that issues of decolonisation draws our attention to gender and waste and the existential exhaustion that plagues the daily labours of maintenance delegated to thousands of Black and brown women, migrants and refugees the world over, as Francois Vergès argues in her very haunting essay, Capitalocene, Waste, Race and Gender. So we see there is so much at stake in following the dirt and deploying something like a dirty theory. I'm not going to read through all of these sections, but I do want to conclude part 6 on dirt and decolonisation. We're both following the material, understanding these very material relations and some of the destructions they wreak and the contaminations they leave behind, and sometimes finding surprising outcomes amidst contamination. So it doesn't necessarily have to be all bad, as I think Anna Tsing demonstrates in her book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, where the Matsutake sort of emerges amidst industrial forestscapes. But we also have to remember that amidst a decolonisation of our practices and a decolonisation of our bad habits in terms of material relations, we also have to undertake, as Isabel Stenges argues after Eduardo Viveros de Castro, a crucial decolonisation of thought. So part and parcel of this process is about reclaiming other possibilities, for instance, well, for philosophy and theory, and I also locate that call within architecture, which offer up a matter of resisting colonizing power, the kind that seeks to judge or even simply to tolerate that which is deemed less civilized, and knowledge practices and belief systems that are judged to be questionable. So a decolonization of thought means resituating our position as critics and thinkers in a discipline such as architecture, and opening ourselves up to other kinds of knowledge practices. In Australia, in fact, I think, and we're hearing this from our students, this is also about really valuing the sorts of Indigenous knowledge practices that we've seen at work in the way land has been managed in this ancient continent for so very long. 60,000 years of continuous work. Now, we've seen all that is at stake in dealing with the dirt. But now I want to take you on a brief journey through a few material stories of infrastructural love. Now, this is where, amidst all of these cares and concerns, we might also find a means of introducing certain of these gestures of the dirt into our pedagogical commitments. And I want to introduce some material, whoops, just trying to get my notes in order. So I'll take the opportunity of introducing just briefly a few pedagogical experiments from a studio I ran when I was still at KTH in Stockholm, a studio called Infrastructural Love, the second version of which was called Infrastructural Care. And I collaborated on this with my colleagues Sepide Karami, Adria Carbonell, and Hannes Freikom. And in fact, I'm happy to say that there will be a forthcoming book associated with the work that we undertook here. And we're helped here by our colleague Bettina Schwarm too, who's our critical graphic designer. And we've got a book in the works called Infrastructural Love, Caring for Our Architectural Support Systems. Now, we know right now from the midst of the pandemic that we are suffering something of what Nancy Fraser already called in 2016 in her essay, The Contradictions of Capital of Care. We are suffering a crisis of care, which extends from care or lack thereof expressed in the home to care expressed at the scale of public spaces and infrastructures. News media has regularly confronted us with the failure of care in homes for the elderly, the failure of care in the vulnerable spaces of domesticity where women have been subjected to even more violence during situations of COVID lockdown, and also failure of care when it comes to childcare, already suffered in various nation states, including Australia, that don't support childcare, thereby impacting on women's career progression. So we know all of these stories are crucial, and I just offer that as a prelude to describing some of the work from the studio, because of course these are experiments that amidst all of this we'll try to seek a way through or a reorientation. These are all important stories to be told. All right, so three brief moments from infrastructural love. And I think the point that I want to make in introducing this student work to you is what we do from the midst of our pedagogical context, and how perhaps it's not even a matter necessarily of the outcome of a design studio exercise, but the process also of material thinking that has been undertaken on the way. So here, for example, we have Marlon Bergman staging the labour, where she's looking at a former airfield in outer Stockholm, the Barkarby airfield, which is slated eventually for residential development. But she's thinking of the in-between times in which a process of soil remediation must be undertaken. So she's asking questions such as, how do we care for the soil here? And at the same time, how do we acknowledge the relation between the labourers on site and the soil, and how do we care for them too? And she produces these series of pavilions, some of which wander across the site. But again, to stress that it's her process of thinking through care here that is as important as the delight that's produced in these mobile pavilions on site. Or perhaps we could look at Marie Lerouzic's explorations dedicated to her site analysis of a former industrial site of Vedesta in outer Stockholm, again a site slated for future residential development, again looking to the in-between times of thinking the remediation of sites and the leftovers of waste and refuse, and working collaboratively, at least in a speculative sense. So this is very much a critical speculative project, working with pigeons, creating both a pigeon coop that is also something of a laboratory to monitor from assessing the pigeon's wings, the levels of pollution in the air. So she's imagining this kind of collaboration between humans and the more than human pigeon in her pigeon towers. Or perhaps even more speculative, we could look to Eric Lecranz's More Than Human Embassy, also located on the former industrial site of Vedesta in outer Stockholm. And here, Eric Lecranz pushes the limits of a poetic pragmatics perhaps to its limit, and begins to ask, how do we pay attention to those creatures that we would otherwise call pests? And he proposes to use the decrepit existing buildings on site and allow them to be inhabited by mold, by rats, by pests and small insects. And he does this by following a very architectural logic. He pays attention to those all of those instruction manuals that tell us how to produce environments that are amenable to human inhabitation, sufficient ventilation, the right measure of moisture, and he turns them around in a process of reversal in order to create a sort of swampy, wet, moist, mold amenable environment for what he calls his more than human embassy. And again, of course, to stress here that it's an exercise in thinking through the implications of this. He's not proposing to actually produce the more than human embassy, but it's been an important part of his discovery in terms of what we can do as critical speculative designers in imagining these other kinds of relations of care. So this leads us to the conclusion now, move 8, part 8, this crucial closing moment, which I have already ventured in the earliest of the 3 books that I've briefly introduced, that is in How to Make Yourself a Feminist Design Power Tool, where I conclude both with following the material which leads us toward an ethics. And here I'm looking at how, through this consideration of dirt as subject matter variously defined and dirty theory as approach that demands we stay close to the ground and acknowledge our environmental embeddedness, how do we move toward an ethics of dirty matters of care? Here also, I'm drawing very much on an important tradition of ethics of care in feminist philosophy. We can include such names as Carol Gilligan. We can think of the important work of Joan Tronto, also Virginia Held, who's commented on this tradition, and more recently, the work of Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, who expands the question of care ethics toward our more than human relations. In her essay, Nothing Comes Without Its World, Thinking with Care, Puig de la Bella Casa writes, in worlds made of heterogeneous, interdependent forms and processes of life and matter, to care about something or for somebody is inevitably to create relation. Care is always about the relations that we form, the encounters that we have. She further explains that knowledge is that the idea that our knowledge is situated amidst our environment worlds, and here she's very much drawing on Donna Haraway's early work where Haraway impresses upon us the importance of situating our knowledge. This notion of situated knowledge means that knowing and thinking are inconceivable without or outside of a multitude of relations that also make possible the worlds we think with. So our very knowledge depends on something like the caring relations we find ourselves within. And from the midst of these caring relations, and we can say much like Foucault's notion of power relations, we do not exist outside of them, that care in both oppressive ways as well as in enabling ways colours our everyday lives and every encounter we discover ourselves within. From the midst of these caring relations, we can also here return to this question of dirt. When you're caring, as anyone knows who's dealt with elderly parents or who has dealt with very young children, your arms are thick into the midst of the dirt of care. But we also find in the midst of this, and here I'm going to close with a quote from Douglas, that in its last phase then, dirt shows itself as an apt symbol of creative formlessness. But it's also from its first phase that it derives a very profound force. And the danger which is risked by boundary transgression, the kinds of boundary transgressions I've explained dirt undertakes, is a kind of power, even a power relation. So I'm riffing on Douglas here. Those vulnerable margins and those attacking forces which threaten to destroy good order represent the powers inherent in the cosmos. Ritual which can harness these for good is harnessing power indeed. So hereby, the conclusion of this work on dirt, we find that, again, the ambivalence of dirt. It can destroy and break down the organic body, but it can be also that which allows other formations to be rendered visible. And here, of course, within the context of architecture, I think we have great lessons to learn in terms of other sorts of caring relations we might bring to bear on the tasks that we consider to be relevant to our discipline. Thanks very much. So I'll close it there.
Thank you so much, Hélène, for that really amazing talk. To the audience, please feel free to type in your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so while you're doing that, I was thinking we could warm up with a question. Hélène, I think it's really amazing in your work how wordplay, rhetorical devices from dirty ditties to dirty drawings really sort of are quite generative. You mix semiotics with affect, with the kind of messiness of discourse is kind of how you talked about it. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about tone and voice as a creative project and process, and ways that kind of can overlap with architecture and the sort of different forms of world making that we participate in.
No, absolutely. So in the last version of this lecture and in some other versions where I talk about dirty theory, I have a section dedicated to dirty ditties and dirty models that I introduce. And in fact, I've also decided that actually perhaps this pertains to dirty performances, dirty ditties and dirty models. And I mean, with dirty performances, one must, of course, make reference to Mel Ukele's maintenance manifesto and the sorts of projects she undertakes, drawing attention to the cleaning labours required to maintain institutions, you know, performing with her very body and so forth. And the dirty ditties for me, a great source of inspiration is the work of Jennifer Bloomer, who I haven't talked about today. And I think it's been interesting for me recently, and with a group of scholars working on this special edition of the Journal of Architecture, to return to Jennifer Bloomer, because I think we find there, my argument would be with the first reception of Jennifer Bloomer, it appears as though she's primarily dealing with the texture of the text. I mean, this we have, of course, in the work on Piranesi and Joyce. It's very obvious her extremely intelligent wordplay. But I think reading her again from the point of view of the present, especially in relation to discourse around new materialism that alerts us to the importance of following the material and acknowledging material embeddedness, we can see that, in fact, really there's a strong relationship to material relations within the work of Bloomer. So I would argue, using a bit of Donna Haraway, that she's already employing a material semiotics. She's mixing her wordplay with the material impact of that wordplay, and showing how the two work together and we can't separate them out. So less than kind of imagining that moment as a purely linguistic turn, we find both in Haraway's work from the 80s and in architecture and Jennifer Bloomer's work, for both of those thinkers, there are with Haraway, the invention of neologisms or new words, of which there are so many, and with Bloomer, a constant play on the text that in fact leads us right back to our material embedded relations. She touches on issues of colonialism. She touches, of course, on issues of reproductive labor. She messes with what is properly associated, what is supposed to be properly associated with the discipline. You know, she opens her essays by, you know, placing us literally on the marital bed and proceeding from that point into a kind of, you know, history of Chicago, for instance. I'm thinking of her Tables of Bower essay. And I think that kind of rhetorical wordplay that you're talking about, for me, increasingly, it is about the material affects that are produced, that there is this power in language. And also that the way we deploy language, and this is some of what we talk about, Naomi and I, in the Writing Architectures book, that language is a performance, that language produces a material impact, and that language in its own right is a site for experimentation. You know, so we don't just use language to write up a report after the effect. It can be this process of experimentation. And so, you know, the beauty of a small book like Dirty Theory, and it's similar in the tone that I use in How to Make Yourself a Feminist Design Power Tool. You know, they're small books, they're direct, they're both of them dirty in that they're very quick, they cover a lot of ground, they're provocative, they sort of ideally sort of open up an invitation to the reader to do their own work in the dirt, or to add their own feminist design power tool to, you know, the examples that I've given. So I guess it's, you know, situated as a sort of call to action in a way, the way I hope the voice carries, and I think it does. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hélène. We have a lot of great questions coming in. And our first one is from Michelle. They ask, could you speak briefly about your take on Deleuze and Guattari's idea of mediators or mediating tactics through an architectural lens?
Okay. Well, you know what? I talk about this in a lecture that I gave at KU Leuven last year, and I bet you anything that you could look it up. Because I think it's on the web somewhere even. And there because they had a lecture series, one part of which was very much interested in the notion of mediators, which is an important concept that Deleuze introduces. And it's part of provoking us to reflect on how we formulate our concepts and how we undertake our practices in theory. That is to say, we never think alone. We always think alongside, you know, a number of influential thinkers, I suppose, but in thinking with them, we also transform the work that they've introduced us. We, to quote Deleuze and Guattari, restore an incomparable novelty to our predecessors by continuing the work of concept construction. But the mediator is that sort of essential figure with whom we think, and mediating tactics, I think, for me, are the way in which we use that thinking with, and the thinking with can happen both with, you know, the big name philosophers, but it can also happen with the people we're sitting right alongside at work. It can happen right alongside our students who provoke us to think. And from this process, we can produce, I think, tactics, or what I would call concept tools, that we can then apply again and share and so forth. There's a bunch to be said about that. I think I go into a bit more depth. So look up this lecture at KU Leuven for more on that.
Thank you. Our second question comes from Sarah Nichols. They ask, thank you so much for this fantastic talk. You called for thinking through material trajectories today rather than a utopian project. Yet at the same time, the work from your wonderfully named studio, Infrastructural Love, is quite speculative. In design studios more generally, how do you negotiate between the confines of contemporary practice and the possibilities that open up through envisioning alternative material cultures?
It is a good question. And, you know, now I'm thinking from the current context that is University of Melbourne, where I've really seen these tensions playing out, because there are, of course, certain expectations of the sort of skill set that an architect should ideally graduate with when they complete, you know, once they've gotten through their 2-year masters that completes their 5-year sort of, I guess, education in architecture. It sort of depends on what track you've taken. And I've been struggling with exactly these kinds of questions with my 2 thesis students this semester, who are undertaking independent theses. And we have a lot of discussions about how they can negotiate between the expectations of the institution that we're producing good architects, but how they can also, you know, take this opportunity to develop their research and be very experimental in what they're venturing in architecture. Because if we're not undertaking that experimentation, then of course we are just continuing to maintain the status quo. I think that the spaces of education offer us an incredible opportunity to undertake this mode of exploration. And I'm always very anxious about the tensions that we find between institutions of higher education and industry expectations. Certainly in the Australian context, there is a lot of pressure on, you know, working with industry. And sometimes I wonder whether we don't risk getting the balance wrong, in that, you know, we have as much to offer industry as, you know, we need to be careful of being simply the handmaid maidens of industry. We have to be the means by which, given our sort of intellectual capital in institutions of higher education, we can speak back to industry and critique some of their assumptions. This is surely the power we have. And so, you know, these are some of the issues that I think your question raises for me. It is that really crucial threshold between education and industry expectations that I think we have to constantly negotiate. I might just leave it there. There's a bunch to be said about the speculative and utopian, but that would lead me down a whole other lecture path. I would just say that people I have been reading on the speculative would include the philosopher Didier Debes, who works closely with Isabelle Stengers, and they have a very particular approach to the speculative as having a pragmatic, you know, mixing together the speculative with the pragmatic. So there's a way of doing that, I think, is all I'll say. Yeah.
Question from Williams. They ask, how do you avoid romanticizing dirt when the labor required to support an institution has never been hidden to those who provide it?
Okay, this is a very, very important question. And it is raised often because there's a terrible conceit in setting up a book that directs itself to dirt. You know, dirty theory, troubling architecture. It proves, you know, perversely and paradoxically immediately attractive. I think this is the sort of ambivalence that is embedded in dirt. We're attracted to that which also repulses us in a way. I think there's definitely that's going on with it, and we see that dynamic in Mary Douglas's early work. And so we are, yes, absolutely always at risk of aestheticizing it would be another problem here. And in that process, you know, getting ourselves further away from the, you know, not very romantic reality of people who are maintaining our institutions and undertaking that daily work. And certainly Maria Puig de la Bella Casa spends quite a lot of time stressing that we have to take care here, not to aestheticize not to aestheticize care either, caring relations. This is a kind of really tricky point, I think. How do we get it right? I think this is kind of just an ongoing challenge. There's not an easy answer to this. So again, in my mind, I'm thinking of Merlu Cayley's, performances where she draws attention to all of that labor and maintenance, whether it's sanitation workers in New York, whether it's, cleaning the steps of a art institution. She is rendering visible and also producing an aesthetic form. And so she's trying to get that balance just right, I assume. I would simply say that, yes, we're always at risk of the romantic and the aesthetic. And the only way we can proceed is to be critically conscious of that and self-reflective in the process.
Question from Harish Krishnamurthy. He said, thank you so much for the talk, Hélène. Could you speak to where you see the canon of architecture fitting or not fitting into these new pedagogies of working with dirt? As you mentioned at the start, to work against these systems of capital production often means having a highly attuned understanding of design. How may practice fit into existing ones?
Okay. No, so this is also a really good question. They're all wonderful questions, actually. All right. Well, I mean, it's probably quite clear from the lecture today that what is animating much of this work is a strong feminist ethos. And this draws, very much also on the time, that I had in Stockholm, where that work is very present in critical studies in architecture. And this means, of course, that something like a canon in architecture is constantly challenged. That is to say, if the canon in architecture is one that represents only a particular kind of architect, who is a heroic architect, who is a masculine architect, then of course we have to break that canon. When critical studies first emerged in the Swedish context to speak to issues of architecture and gender, it was because students were actually coming to us. There was a kind of groundswell of concern. Younger students were coming to us saying, in my history of architecture lectures, I'm not hearing anything about women in architecture. So this is a moment at which we see the erasures produced by something like a canon. So the work, which might not necessarily mean that we have to dispense with the canon, but it means that the canon is not a fixed structure. It is too something that requires constant maintenance and addition, and that we have to be constantly alert to who is being represented and to what kind of figure of an architect is being privileged in the midst of this. And you've got a second part of your question too, which is this question of being attuned to our understanding of design. Any mode of critique has to understand the situation that it's critiquing, which does require a sort of intimate knowledge. We can kind of offer renovations to what we understand by design renovation by understanding some of its histories, its trajectories, and understanding where we can continue to intervene so as to perhaps reorientate, what design can do in our worlds.
Question from Coco Tin. They ask, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the aesthetics of dirt, dirty theory, dirty drawings, etc. How do we resist a fetishizing, taming, cleansing process and remain in this discomfort?
Well, I guess this is also exactly the challenge that Donna Haraway introduces to us in her book, Staying with the Trouble. How do we stay in those zones of slight discomfort and not attempt to solve all these problems, but understand that we just have to continue to cope and get by and seek out joy where it's possible amidst the terror. So just thinking about that quote that I had from her earlier. This is a little bit similar to the previous question too, which asked about the romanticization of dirt and the aestheticization of dirt. And yes, we're always at risk of this. And I think this is also why I spent a bit of time stressing that with those 3 student projects, the imagery, particularly, in fact, the imagery for all projects is very evocative. But at the same time, it was the process and the sort of reorientation of their design thinking that was the most crucial outcome. Nevertheless, I think that as designers, we do have this incredible capacity to visualize potential worlds, and I know I'm risking here sounding like I'm looking for utopia, but I'm not. It's rather these alternative twists on reality in a way, and the process of visualization can be a very powerful first argumentative step for thinking otherwise. So despite the risks, I think we do need, in a critical and careful way, to deploy our image-making capacities so as to provoke a rethinking of our architectural habits. So we do need to even sometimes get a little bit dirty with the mean tricks of affect-laden imagery if they're going to bring forward an argument that we're making. I'm thinking actually of Liam Young's really beautiful Planet City video that's recently been screening at the Triennale in Melbourne, which produces this imagination of removing from the whole of the planet Earth all urban development and concentrating it in one sort of a very dense moment, and doing that by drawing on vast amounts of scientific and other research into technological means of more sustainable approaches to living, to consuming and producing and so forth. And he produces this incredibly evocative and beautiful video, and one can be very taken in by the video. It's got this pink hue, which makes it very, I think, which sort of calms the critical senses. And yet it is an argument that is being made in that video that asks us to think about processes of urbanization. So it's a bit of a knife edge that we balance on. And yes, there's always the risks that you're drawing attention to. Nevertheless, I think we do also need to deploy these skills that we have in architecture to make a change, to communicate a message. I think these are really important skills.
Ellen, maybe just to kind of, as I'm consolidating these thoughts, and thank you for your amazing presentation, I wanted to lean in a little bit on the title. So following the dirt, and like staying with the trouble of following the dirt. It prompts us to realize that, I guess, dirt moves. Architects move dirt all the time. We subtract, we add without thinking about the dump elsewhere. And so could you speak a little bit about movement versus keeping it in the ground, and how do we care about the dirt before or after it becomes a kind of architectural problem?
No, absolutely. Well, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to speak to this in the most eloquent terms, but if I could grab one of our wonderful PhD students, in fact, 2 of our wonderful PhD students currently working at the University of Melbourne. There's Virginia Mannering, who's been looking across Melbourne at exactly construction sites, and also massive construction sites and past events of the massive movement of dirt that have, on a kind of terraforming level, geographically transformed what Melbourne once was prior to a colonial settlement. And so, in her emerging PhD project, she's demonstrating how we need to look at these, other environments, as David Gisson might describe them, these sub-natures of architecture, and understand that in, rising our towers, we're also redistributing so much dirt. And I think these projects such as Virginia's, in the making, allow us to look at architecture from another point of view, one that perhaps we haven't been paying enough attention to, very much just by thinking about the redistributions of dirt. It's also why I quickly put up the cover from Jane Hutton's book, Reciprocal Landscapes, because of course, this is a beautiful example across her series of chapters of literally in a very, immediate way, she places herself in these landscapes, which she must have been very fortunate to be able to do, and tracks the movements of granite from Maine onto the sidewalks of New York, or tracks the kind of bird shit that has accumulated into a pile of guano on the islands off the coast of Peru, tracks its history of distribution in Central Park. And, so this is to render extremely visible the mobilizations of, well, dirt, very broadly defined, obviously, here. And I think with these works that we're seeing emerging on the scene, we have another kind of environmental consciousness that's being so powerfully rendered available to us. Another one of my PhD, well, Virginia, I'm on her chair, but then one of my PhD students, Therese Keogh, also is looking at issues of extractivism and looking at the sort of redistributions of the dirt following mining, moments of mining historically and so forth as well. And so I'm seeing more and more of this sort of scholarship emerging, which I think, offers great contributions to how we figure our discipline.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I'm afraid we're out of time. And so on behalf of Rice Architecture, we'd like to call for a virtual round of applause, and thank you, Ellen, for sharing with us your work this evening, for paying attention to matters of dirt and maintenance of care that are too often considered out of place in architecture. So to our audience, please join us on this week, Wednesday, April 21st at 6:30 p.m. Central Time for the Rice Design Alliance Civic Forum on Power, Who Decides Houston's Resiliency. Thank you so much, Ellen, and to everyone for coming. Have a great evening.
Thanks so much. All right, have a great evening. Bye.